bit of an opportunity for a procedural reset, and to kind of reflect on where we've gone wrong, where we've lost our way, but also bring some issues back to the agenda and make sure we can tackle those going forward. And when it comes to plastic production, this has been, let's be honest, a kind of politically divisive issue. There's been some really meaningful proposals put on the table, but the conversation hasn't been able to advance. So whilst countries have recognised the importance of tackling this, we haven't yet identified what that pathway forward for this issue is going to look like. And at the same time, the impacts are really worsening. So now, for those of you that aren't kind of in the weeds of the process, now we have a new chair of the INC, and we have an opportunity to revisit this important issue. And there's an opportunity with a new text being developed over the summer where we hope to see this reflected. And what we're hoping to do with this report and with this conversation is essentially kickstart a dialogue about how we can bring this back into the text and what those pathways look like and what are the opportunities for collaboration to bend that curve. So hopefully that's kind of provided some adequate scene setting for everybody about, why we're here and what we're going to be doing over the next sort of 40 minutes or so. And so without further ado, I will hand over to Hannah, who will take us through the main findings from the report.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for being here today. So I'm just going to really quickly do a quick overview of the model's methodology and then go into a bit of the results as well, just before we get into the panel discussion. So how does the models work? So despite there being a variety of plastic polymers on the market, this report and these models focus on standard plastic polymers. These are the ones that are used in everyday applications, and they account for about 90% of global plastic demand. Through the analysis, plastic production refers to total polymer production, including both primary, so your virgin, and your secondary, so your recycled polymers. This is a system model design, so it's to test how production, consumption, waste, and greenhouse gas emissions respond to upstream measures. So let's get a bit more into what the models actually are modeling. So we wanted to look at plastic production and consumption. So to do this, we used data from OECD and Polyglobe. And we also, for waste generation and mismanaged waste, we used OECD data as well, and the global plastic outlook data. And for the greenhouse gas emissions, we used the LBNL data, the US EPA's waste reduction models, and the Plastic Recycler Europe data. Just to note that we didn't do these models, it was Eunomia. We worked very closely with them and they have done some incredible work, and you'll see that when we show you the results. But what we've asked them to do is kind of based on country groupings that we observed in the INC process. So these were kind of drawn on consistent interventions and submissions rather than informal negotiation blocks, but we asked them based on that to produce 4 models. So the first one being business as usual. So this is if countries don't agree to reduce production and consumption. So things carry on the way they're going. And then the first scenario we asked them to model was the coalition of the willing. So these are your like Nice and HAC wake up call countries and your HAC countries. And then we were really interested in the role China has to play. So this was scenario 2, sorry. So China is the biggest producer. They are they produce around 36% of standard polymers globally. So they are the biggest producer by far. And we just wanted to see how that changes the dynamics. But then we were also quite interested to see for scenario 3, what happens if we had the coalition of the willing plus China plus middle countries. So these are countries that their economies are emerging, but also they may follow China if they agree to reduce their production and consumption. So what these models start to look at, so with the countries, they're now participating countries. So what the model started to do is get them to reduce both their production and their consumption by 40% by 2040. And this is starting from the year 2030, and their baseline levels is like what they produced from 2026. So they have to reduce that by and but because obviously the world isn't always that, it's not straightforward, we also had to look at trade. So trade is a really big deal when it comes to these models, and you'll see it more when you look at the results. But we had to do two model cases. So this is where production and consumption can kind of shift between participating countries and non-participating countries. So this is your unrestricted trade, and restricted trade is where participating countries cannot trade with non-participating countries. So this allows us to test for leakages, so whether production and consumption simply just moves elsewhere when some countries act. But it is important to note that these models are like explanatory rather than predictive. They do not tell the future, but they are designed to show how the system behaves under different levels of ambition and participation. So let's kind of move on to the most interesting bit, which is like the results. And I do apologize, it's going to be quite a bit number heavy, but I have tried to keep it as not that number heavy as possible. Amy, if you wouldn't mind changing the slide. So let's begin with production. So production is the core of the plastic crisis. And what we found, what the models show, that under business as usual is predicted to rise between 766 million tonnes by 2040. But when you start in to induce upstream measures, the impacts are immediate. So for the scenario one, so your coalition of the willing, the reduction is around 16 to 18%. So 16% for unrestricted trade and 18% for restricted trade. These percentages increase with ambition and participation. For scenario two, this is 28% for unrestricted trade and 38% for restricted. And for scenario three, it is around 45% for both. Again, this shows that with stronger participation, there's a larger global impact. So trade dynamics is important because when fewer countries agree to reduce their production and consumption, this can move elsewhere, it can be displaced. But when more countries commit, the outcomes across the trade scenarios converge. This displacement is dramatically reduced. Next slide, please, Amy. This is the same for polymer consumption and polymer use. So consumption is like the main driver of demand in the plastic system. So under business as usual, again, it's a 766 million tonnes by 2040. And the percentages of reduction are roughly the same as production. So again, you're looking at your 16 to 18% reduction for scenario one, 28 to 30% reduction in scenario two, and again, around a 45% for both unrestricted and restricted trade for scenario three. And what this basically, sorry. So basically what this kind of says is for countries must limit trade. Trade is a big deal. That this leads to the better environmental outcome for both production and consumption. So if global negotiations fail and countries move ahead with smaller grouping agreements, trade restrictions need to be seriously considered. Unless countries are achieving the same level as the most ambitious scenario, so your scenario three. And we can kind of also see this when we look at mismanaged waste and waste generated as well. So I'll move on to that. Amy, next slide, please. Thank you. So for plastic waste generated, so under the business as usual, it is expected to raise to 621 million tonnes annually by 2040. For scenario one, this Scenario 1 reduces it by 17 to 19%. Scenario 2 is 28 to 38% reduction. And scenario 3, sorry, too many numbers, is 44% reduction. So again, the scale of plastic waste generated reduces with increased ambition and coordination. Trade again has a big impact especially when you're looking at scenarios 1 and 2, but when you're coming down to scenario 3, because more countries are participating, the production and consumption can't shift. The plastic waste generated in the countries can't be shifted to non-participating countries. And for mismanaged waste, this is where we start to see like the biggest percentage reduction. So Amy, if you can go to the next slide, thank you. Plastic waste mismanagement and litter. So again, this is the biggest percentage decrease. So with under business as usual, you're talking around 112 million tons annually by 2040. For scenario 1, we're talking about 16 to 18% decrease. And with broader participation drives declines. So if we're looking at scenario 2, it drops quite dramatically from to about 84 to 72 million tons of plastic. And this is a 25 to 30% decrease from business as usual. But when we start looking at scenario 3, this is where the biggest reduction happens, because it's a more than 50% decrease, which is quite incredible with all these countries agreeing and participating together. Again, with the trade, it just means that as you can see, there's very little difference, in scenario 3. So it's like 53 million tons in unrestricted, but restricted it's 53. So very, very small difference between them. And this is just because, pollution can't shift between, is eliminated. It can't shift between participating and non-participating countries, because more countries are now agreeing to cut their production and consumption. But obviously this isn't just a pollution and issue, it's also a climate issue. So when we start looking at the climate impact, so Amy, if you could jump to the next slide, please. Again, it's, the same, it can be said for the climate impact. So, so plastic is a major and growing source of greenhouse gas emissions across its full life cycle. And under business as usual, annual emissions rise to over 3.8 gigatons of CO2 equivalent by 2040. Cumulative emissions reach around 51 gigatons by 2040. So to put this in perspective, that is like the 39%. That consumes, 39% of the remaining carbon budget to keep, global warming like under 1.5 degrees. But when we start looking at the different scenarios, you can see there was decrease with each of the scenarios. So for scenario 1, it's between 4.5 gigatons. For scenario 2, it's between 6 and 9. And for scenario 3, it is 10 gigatons of CO2. So again, emissions kind of reduce with the scale of participation and ambition. And plastic is becoming a real big emission driver, especially in its production phase. So that's it from me. So that is just a bit of a high level, like what the methodology and what it's saying. So now we can move on to the panel discussion, unless anyone does have any clarifying questions that I can do my best to answer. Just to note, Eunomia did do the model. So if there's any real high-tech questions about how they did the model, I might have to move on to I might have to pass it on to them. But thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Hannah. There were two clarifying questions in the chat, which I think you can answer, at least on the first. So one was just somebody asked if we included USA in the modeling, and if not, why not? But yeah.
So no, they were, well, yes and no. They were only included in the business as usual. So that was all the countries within the INC were included in the business as usual. They weren't included in the other models just because of their current stand on a lot of environmental issues. It's very unlikely that they currently will agree to cut their production and consumption. So we didn't include them. So your petrol, so just to clarify, your like petrol states, so your gas and oil producers was not included in any of the models apart from business as usual.
Thanks, Hannah. So yeah, basically, yeah, the discussion that we had was, it's really around countries that we think would be likely to join, and at this time, we did not think that included the USA. I'm happy to be proven wrong. The second question was about the LBNL data set that we used, and whether the greenhouse gas emissions that were part of that were based on a life cycle, or I guess that's a question from Ron. I don't know if he's wondering there if it's only looking at emissions on a particular stage of the life cycle. If you don't know, I thought Tim, you might know. But
I do believe they did do the full life cycle. So I do think they did start off from production and end of life. I am happy for Tim to jump in if he can clarify a bit
I'll
more.
jump in, yeah, because I looked at this very closely. Thank you, Ron, for that question. It was the LBNL life cycle, so from extraction all the way to polymerization and then product manufacture, and then it included the use phase where we actually saw reductions because it's a lightweight material, and then it went to the end of life management where we saw emissions again. So I think that's the full life cycle in my opinion, and it takes account emissions and environment and climate benefits as well.
Cool. Thank you so much for that clarification. And Tim, you can just stay where you are now because I'm going to introduce the panel discussion. Thank you so much, Hannah, for that. I know that was not an easy task to present such a comprehensive modeling in like 10 to 15 minutes, but I think you did a great job. And, just to say that we have already had people ask us questions about the modeling. If you're interested in anything that Hannah presented and you'd like to just get in touch and ping us an email to delve into anything, we're really happy to have feedback and answer questions. So don't be afraid to reach out. So now we're just going to move into the panel section. And so I think Amy is sort of in the background spotlighting people to bring them to your front page of your Zoom. But so the panel that is going to be joining us now includes Dr. Savendra Michael, who's a permanent secretary for the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, Fiji, who will be a very familiar face to those of us who attend the plastics negotiations. We'll also be joined by Deborah Cisneros, who's a climate change analyst at the Ministry of Environment for Panama, who I think is joining us now from the Jeff Assembly. So really appreciate you being able to do that and jump on. And also Professor Bethany Carney-Almroth, who will also be quite familiar to those of you who've been involved in the INC. She is a professor of ecotoxicology at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and a very prominent and active member of the Scientists Coalition, since pretty much the beginning, if not earlier, in the negotiations. And then last but definitely not least, we're joined by my colleague Tim from the Environmental Investigation Agency, who's a senior lawyer and policy advisor in our team, and very active, not just on plastics, but also climate change issues as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Really appreciate this. And I think from this conversation, I think what we'd really like to do is just to tease out a little bit. We've had the kind of technical overview, what's happening in plastic production and consumption, what are some possible scenarios of collaboration or cooperation which could have impacts for the environment, but what does that actually mean in the kind of reality that we exist in, both our lived realities, but also the plastics negotiations. So what I would do is just kind of open the floor for some reflections, sort of general reflections on the findings of the report and what they mean for the context that you're working in, and sort of reflect a little bit on how negotiations are progressing on the issues of plastic production and consumption. So maybe Dr. Michael, I'll go to you first, and then to Debbie. And thank you for joining us at 1 a.m. also. Sorry, yeah, that's very most generous of you.
Sure, no worries. So Bulavinaka colleagues and warm greetings from the Pacific. Just in terms of the questions that were asked, in terms of the findings on the report, particularly for our context, for the Pacific Seeds perspective, it has always been clear that a equitable or effective plastics treaty must address the full life cycle of plastic, which is basically what is clearly articulated in the UNEA Resolution 514. So we are very clear that it needs to include production, it needs to include consumption, and this has always been a key part of our position from the beginning of the negotiations, ever since it has started. We have also consistently said that measures focusing only on the downstream solutions will not be sufficient. And that's clearly also articulated in the modeling work that has been shown in the report. We already had made it clear that we have, in our own national context, we are already doing waste management, recycling, cleanups, disposal systems, all of which are very important, but we cannot carry the burden alone if the production angle is not, adequately addressed. And so consumption will be growing at the current pace as well. We also, have maintained the stance where we talk about impacts, because I think it's only fair that we talk about impacts from a specific context. And for us, as a major or net importer of plastics, we, of the 14 Pacific Island countries, 13 of them mostly import plastic, only one produces plastics. We have every time, made sure that we talk about how overproduction, overconsumption are not only waste issues. And so basically looking at how key sectors of our economies, how they affect food security, how they affect the health of marine ecosystems, and basically their link, as the report has shown, to greenhouse gas emissions, and as Tim has just mentioned. So I think for us, the new EIA report is very important, the one that we have just looked at, because it really reinforces this concern. It shows how if we mismanage waste and emissions, will continue to grow, and if countries will not move towards reducing plastic production, we will have a issue that overconsumption and overproduction that I've just mentioned. I think we also need to take these findings very seriously and consider how the ongoing negotiations can meaningfully advance in this area. In terms of the current state of negotiations, I like to pause and just really recognize that the discussions on plastic production are still at its infancy stage. I say this because we have not had enough time, or enough adequate negotiating time, and we have not tried different approaches to really resolve our divergence. And whether that flexibility, whether that is a flexibility mechanism or differentiated timelines or something else, I cannot answer that, but I know that that's something that most of us are thinking around as well. At times, it has also felt like a binary discussion where measures are in or measures are out without exploring any middle ground. And I think that's very concerning for us as well. On the key issues that we continue to face as negotiators in terms of divergence, one is to include the production or supply-based measures, and second, that's very sensitive, and maybe Debs will touch on this, is the scope and the design of such provisions, like whether they should include a global production reduction target, or whether we should have the nature of national measures, their legally binding nature, and so forth. And I think most of the delegations, they want to really engage very constructively but our progress has also been very slow because of the political sensitivities around it. And we also have to be very mindful that while entering the next phase, we also are going to recognize the critical element of what's happening right now in the geopolitics with the fossil fuel industry as well as the fuel production. But I think most importantly right now is, how does the full life cycle actually be addressed or reflected in the instrument. So again, for PCs, we really want to maintain the position that we want to be constructive, we want to be solution oriented. We need the atmosphere to be the same way, even in areas where it's so difficult to move on. We hope that the new chair, as well as the responses on the latest available science, such as the one we've just have access to, the report that has just been shared with us, it will really help us to move forward. I really think that the options presented in this report will really, whether or not it's acceptable to other countries that are continuing to push back, but for us, we will welcome further discussion on the complementary approaches that may help us to maintain the momentum that we need, and also help us to remain transparent and be open to broader participation over time. For us, this has been a proven method in other MEAs that we negotiate, and we know that it can also work here, recognizing the importance of the issue and the differing state of readiness that we have across our countries. So with these few words, thank you so much, and I pass it over to Deborah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. I think that's really kicked us off. And yeah, Debbie, I should have said in my introduction that, Panama have really been at the forefront of the conversations around how to advance plastic production in the treaty. And I think, you in particular, you've been doing some hard labor behind the scenes to try and move this issue forward, which I think people are very grateful for. So I should have said that. I'd love to hand over to you and hear some of your thoughts on this.
Thank you very much, Christina, and thank you, Sivendra. I completely agree with everything you said. And I mean, the numbers shown in this report should alarm anyone, even if they don't follow the treaty. But for countries like us, like the PCs, like Panama, it's very important because it has different dimensions. For example, for health, the problematic polymers rely on hazardous additive, and for us, we don't produce plastic. We don't have petrochemical facilities, but we have populations that burn that plastic waste, and this is a risk. So it's directly related to public health. If, in another hand, we have also equity. If we talk about economy, like how this affect those petrochemical countries, for us also affects the burden of investing in new infrastructure for waste management. The numbers showing in the report also alarms, because if now we don't have enough money to manage what we are handling now, in 10 years will be even worse. And for Panama, also same for the PCs, we have our canal watershed, we have our Pacific and Caribbean coast, that conserves a lot of important biodiversity. So this is really important to us. These are national assets. So that's why we are pushing to talk about this topic, because as Michael said, we haven't had enough time to discuss this topic during negotiations. We never have enough time. Always this topic is just left to the end when we have less than 30 minutes. And we start when the topic comes into the agenda, we start talking about something else that we should talk before going into production. So it's important, I think, now that the process is kind of reset with this new beginning, this new chair, we are now waiting to see how the head of delegations meeting goes. It's important that we open the space to have that discussion and try to collaborate and really see what the landing zone could be, because it's important for every country to show a little bit of flexibility in this process, and specifically in this topic, which is really important. And yeah, Panama thinks that in the status of the negotiations, we need to keep pushing. We are not going to give up on production and the life cycle of plastics. It's for us, it's important, and we understand that every country has different levels and will have different levels to meet the final goal. But we need a final goal. We need an objective. We need something. We need a path that can feel us free of plastic production, plastic pollution. I'm sorry. So yes, this is now that we are starting again the negotiations, the discussions is an important time for us, like the PCs, Panama, and the other countries that also support high ambition in this treaty, to try to get those conversations in the official spaces and try to really discuss this topic, which is hard, I know, but we need to try to get into that conversation in the official spaces, so other countries won't take that point for them to hold the topic. So yeah, that's my take from this.
Thanks, Debbie. I think that's super helpful. And yeah, firstly, agree completely that I think the findings are a wake-up call for everyone, not just in our little bubble of the treaty negotiations. So thank you for mentioning that. And also, yeah, I think you've both kind of brought this conversation to the point that, yeah, we need to have some practical approaches. So we need the new chair to look at how we're actually going to have this conversation and move it forward. So perhaps that's something that can kind of come out, like some ideas might spark out of this conversation. So Bethany, I'll turn to you now, and thank you again for joining us. And I think, the Scientists Coalition have been really active on this topic, and kind of trying to raise the profile of it, but would be really interested to hear some reflections from you about sort of where things stand and how you see it going forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you both to Hannah, the report writers, and to the previous speakers for raising some really important points. And we all, I think, agree, many of us, or all of us on this call, I hope, agree that plastics production is beyond what we're able to manage on the planet and in our societies, both across the full life cycle. So there's a lot of reasons of why that is the case, and this report touches on some of those, on the climate impacts, for example. But it doesn't include all of the kinds of impacts that you could see from plastics production, consumption, and waste. Some of them came up in the following conversations around human health impacts, around toxic chemicals, around waste management. And these are all very true. If we start looking at the costs, both in terms of economic costs, but also in terms of harms to people and the environment, we can see that these, again, are unjustly distributed across ecosystems, across environmental compartments, across countries, across groups of people. So who is being exposed during the extraction phase, production phase, use phase, waste phase, and what the costs are there are significant and not always accounted for in economic modeling for the industry and countries that, to be honest, a lot of petrostates have very close ties to production in their national economies, part ownership of companies and such. So this is where science can come in and help us really build an understanding of why we need to reduce production, both from a climate perspective, from a toxicity and a pollution perspective, from impacts on biodiversity, impacts on human health. But then science might also help us to understand how we can get here. So your report has done a really nice job of looking at different models and scenarios on reduction when you're using different sort of levers to entice or to bring down production numbers. But then we'll always have this question around plastics as a useful material. And this is something that we hear come up in a lot of spaces, and Tim touched on it a little bit when talking about the use phase, where plastics reduced greenhouse gas emissions because they're lighter materials for transportation. And while that is true, there are a lot of other impacts that occur. So we have to ask the question, if we are using plastics, where are we using them and where do we need to use them? Are they essential in some products to protect human health, protect the function of society? And if we do identify spaces where we need plastics, then we should also be able to look at those products and find ways to make them safer and more sustainable. And again, taking a perspective across the full life cycle, can we design products that don't contain toxic chemicals or hazardous chemicals that aren't going to be prone to leaching microplastics and nanoplastics that aren't easily lost to the environment, and that can be managed at their end of life, so that there's a way to take care of the materials that we are producing and using so that we can do it better. And then if we're able to bring in all these different aspects of essentiality, of sustainability, and of safety, then we can start producing only what we actually need. And all of the rest of the plastics, these plastics that we don't need, we can move away from those. So we'll move into a space where we're making products that are safer and more sustainable and necessary for the functioning of society, and not making all of the rest of the stuff. And this is not an easy path forward. And as you, I think, said in the report, it doesn't predict the future. But we have to use science, and we have to use the knowledge that exists in all of these spaces with decision makers and policymakers and all the different actors across different sectors in society, and find a path forward. How can we do this better? So this is, I think, where I'll stop my comments for now and say that if we can better incorporate a broad understanding of safety, sustainability, and essentiality across the full plastics life cycle, across ecosystems, and across aspects of human health, then we can do this better.
Thanks so much, Bethany. And I really also appreciate you bringing in the health dimension. You know, when we'd originally looked at data that was available to do the modeling, we really wanted to look at, is there a way that we could also model health impacts? But it just doesn't exist. That information doesn't exist in a way that we could directly translate into this model. So that was unfortunately something we had to leave out. But yeah, it's great that so much work is being done around the health conversation, and particularly around the upstream impacts of on health. So thank you.
Yeah, we're working on doing that. It's very fractionated data. We have data on some chemicals, and we have data on some kinds of impacts, on data on some groups of people at certain life stages. But I think that data set and that evidence set will grow.
Yeah, amazing. Great. Okay, last but not least, Tim, I was just going to turn to you now you've had the benefit also of hearing what everyone else had to say, to add some reflections from your perspective as well.
Yes, thank you. I won't try to repeat any of the points that have already been stated more articulately than I could do myself. But I'll just add 3 takeaways that I got from this report. And then I'll take a crack at the US question that was in the chat as well, from my perspective. So first, for me, this report underscores that there just must be some minimum ambition in this treaty to be able to achieve our purpose. I mean, the report looked at 40% reduction by 2040 against 2026 baseline. And we need to see the full suite of measures within that to be able to deliver on that goal. However we craft them, it's a combination of many, but we need to see them in the treaty. Otherwise, we're not even going to achieve the numbers that we see set out in the report, which would be particularly troubling. And we will have essentially done to plastic pollution what we did to 1.5 degrees Celsius under climate change, which is kick the can down the road, and that the next generation have to deal with the repercussions and the cleanup, the mess. So by the full suite of measures, I mean those on, a global objective on sustainable production and consumption, and where appropriate measures to eliminate certain products, reporting, product design, sectoral approaches, so addressing packaging, fishing gear, agriculture, textiles, and then specific provisions on microplastics, which have been largely ignored or slightly ineffectively treated within some of the later chair's versions. And I'll just note that the irony is that, with the exception of the finance issue, which I didn't mention, that the very measures I just listed above is where you see the like-minded group of blockers marking them up with the brightest of red lines. So they actually, we're in a bit of a binary situation where, what we need and what we know we need to be able to achieve the reductions necessary are the red lines that are taken by a small group of countries. And so we need to think about what that means. Second is, I think, with the scenarios, scenario 1, 2, and 3, I think it shows that the middle, and I'll say small powers, if I can borrow Prime Minister Carney's language, it shows that the middle and small powers of the world, and by this I mean the high ambition countries and friends, should not hesitate to demand flexibility mechanisms to enhance their cooperation and coordination within the treaty, or be willing and ready to step outside of it. If we're going to get any meaningful dents on plastic pollution and climate emissions and plastic waste management, we're going to need some way to work towards achieving the goals or the numbers that are outlined approximately within the figure. I mean, within the model. And so, there's a lot of reasons one might think about why it'd be useful, right? It'll help with their economies because they'll have a decreased waste management burden. And we heard how Panama burns a lot of their plastic waste, and that also causes health problems. But there's also just the cost of management that is borne by households. It would help protect the global environment, in particular against plastic pollution, and it'll help reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a time when that is probably the single most important thing that we can do to save humanity and some semblance of Earth as it is. So the second takeaway is work within the INC process and make some clear demands directionally to be able to not be held back by a small group of blocking countries, but do not settle for an effective treaty and be willing to walk out and work together to work together for a Carney Convention or some other instrument, however you want to call it, but to work together outside the INC process if necessary to be able to achieve our ambitions. So that's the second point. And then the third point, lastly, I'll just mention, is that in scenario 2, when you throw in China with the coalition of the willing, it's quite interesting. They basically double the benefits across the board. And that just speaks to the fact that this is a very large country with a disproportionate impact. But it also, for me, it also tells a slightly another story as well. It's that, when you look at where we are today, and the last few years have been wild, to put a word on it, but we live in a fast-changing geopolitical landscape that has tipped beyond the point of return. There is no going back to the geopolitics of yesterday. We are now moving into a brave new world, and we must adapt. There's no single election in any given country that's going to change directionally where we're headed. It's happened. And within this emerging geopolitical landscape, I think China has a unique opportunity. China could step in and fill the leadership void at the top, work with the high ambition countries and friends, and negotiate a treaty that effectively reduces plastic production and consumption. Or let's just say provide some sanity or logic to it. And in so doing, China could cement its role as a global leader on the international stage. I see it as a really unique opportunity for China to break free from some of its old positionings based on its status as a developing country, its recipient of ODA that would be provided under the funds to help others, to advance more effective provisions within the various articles that actually help achieve the reductions that we're seeking. And in that way, really step up to the plate and take advantage of this time of uncertainty and show the world that it's ready to lead. So those are 3 takeaways that I get from the report, and I will leave it there. Oh, actually, I promised to answer the US question. Yes. Well, my accent betrays me, so I'm American, and you can probably hear that. But I've also lived outside of the US for over 15 years. And so living outside the US and having, being introduced to the media environments in other places, as well as working at the international stage, I think there's something I'd like to tell the listeners on this webinar. So on the one hand, for those who are within the US, I don't think we recognize, by and large, how much we have undermined our historical role at the international stage. And irreparably are not going to be able to go back to the situation as it was. For those outside the US, as you follow the US news, I think it's sometimes hard to appreciate how irreparably damaged the internal system has been within the US. I'm just going to say it bluntly. I'm not trying to politicize this webinar, but we see open bribery and corruption now in the US government. And we see things that shock the conscience, and the mechanics of the government are being used to protect or perpetuate some of these activities. So we're in a fundamentally different world. So you take that, the U.S. uncertainty, we'll just call it, and you combine it with the fact that the U.S. has not joined the international instrument in decades. We're inclined to leave them out of the scenarios, other than business as usual, under the notion that they would not be supportive of effective measures, and even if they were, because there was perhaps a change of administration, it might not be able to join the treaty as a party. So that's the reason why I think the U.S. was left out of the scenarios.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, and thank you for tackling both China and the USA in one in one intervention. That's very brave. Cool. So I was just looking in the chat for sort of follow-up questions, and there was a question around transparency, which Bethany and Savendra, you both kind of added some comments in the chat too. But I was wondering if either of you wanted to elaborate on that, because I think transparency was raised initially as a question in the context of subsidies for plastic production, so the expansion of production. But I think thinking about sort of treaty design and application, it's transparency means a lot more than that. And so I was wondering if either of you wanted to kind of share your thoughts on how transparency relates to the topic of plastic production and any sort of recommendations you might have. Maybe Savendra, you've come off mute, so maybe you could go first, and then Bethany.
Yeah, I think it, like you said, it can be linked in a couple of ways, and this could be linked to national reporting, transition planning. We could recognize, the common but differentiated, responsibilities, different national circumstances. So I think the way we see it is where transparency comes in is that if we focus on redirecting support towards solutions, reuse systems, safer alternatives, circular economy, infrastructure, then it should be transparent on how much of the support is provided towards those transitions. And so for us, it's really important, because if we are already carrying the cost of plastic pollution, then the treaty should not only help us manage the impacts, but it should also try and look at from a transparency lens, like how are we shifting the signals, right? The economic signals that are driving the problem in the first place. So I think that's, for us, it's a coherent, it's a coherent approach, because we need to, like I said in the chat, like you need to be carefully navigating through this, because a practical way forward could be for the treaty to encourage countries to report on their subsidies or their incentives that support plastic production, and then maybe also how much of that is actually diverted towards transitioning away from plastic. So I think it needs to be.
And I'm going to bring in different aspects of transparency here. So part of it would be around production, and that would make the kind of work that you've been doing here easier if countries could openly and transparently report what they're producing in terms of what kinds of polymers, in terms of what kinds of chemicals and additives, in terms of masses and volumes. But it would also require transparency around what's being put into products, because this is an area where we have very little knowledge to date. And maybe you've all heard the number 16,000 chemicals that are used or present in plastics. 4,200 of those have known hazardous properties, and more than 10,000 lack data. So we don't always know what's in the products that we're using and being exposed to. We don't know what impacts are having on our health. It also makes the circular economy, like recycling plastics, very difficult, and to be honest, not possible to do in a safe and sustainable manner to date, because this data is not shared openly, first off, and that data that is available is not really traveling through the value chain. So different actors along the plastics life cycle don't have access to this, and this makes waste management even more difficult, and it makes consumers' exposures even more complicated. So that kind of transparency would help us better track the kinds of problems that we're facing, and also maybe find ways to do things better. And then again, transparency in reporting of data from monitoring the effectiveness of the treaty. And this could be on emissions and releases. This can be on production. It can be on trade and transportation. It can be on consumption, use, waste production, incineration, all of these things, which would help us better understand how well the treaty is solving the problems that we're trying to solve, and whether things need to be adjusted over time once the treaty exists and is implemented. So I think there's a lot of places where we could work with the word transparency. It covers a lot of ground.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very well explained. And yeah, and I just, for those of you that don't know, if you want to do like modeling, like the work that we've done here, it basically involves purchasing, expensive proprietary data sets, which are also reliant on self-reported industry data. So it's kind of like a best guess, but it's not a substitute for some kind of like mandatory requirement to provide data that's applicable for everybody. And so at the moment, that access to information is really difficult. Tim, you came off mute. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, just to underscore quickly with some numbers. A few years back when we last looked in the EU, so the European Union, the 27 member states, there were 54 polymer producers, which is a really small regulated community to be requesting reporting from. It expands when you look at the polymer converters. It goes to, it's a ballpark, but I think it was around 50,000 polymer converters within the EU. So those are the people who actually take the pellets and then would convert them into a plastic product. And there, there's different stages between that, and chemicals get added, and at that stage, and at the product manufacturer. But that's a larger community. Not, however, like the community that would be required to submit greenhouse gas information. And so, at least from a polymer production perspective, this should be quite simple. And so you look at the other regions, and given that EU is around a quarter or a third of the production, depending on who you believe, that it would probably be similar numbers in the other jurisdictions. And so you could really easily request and secure the data on polymer production. And then similarly, it's not unlike greenhouse gases and the number of regulated actors. In fact, I would think it's much lighter. And we request greenhouse gas emissions data. So just wanted to underscore that we're not, I don't think we're asking a lot here. It is just a political question.
Thanks, Tim. And yeah, I think just maybe Debbie, a question to you. I think you sort of highlighted a couple of ways in which we need to navigate the pathway forward. And if you sort of had the opportunity now to sort of make a request of the chair or your fellow negotiators, how they could best kind of work together with Panama to support the work that you've been doing to raise the profile of the issue of plastic production. Do you have any sort of quick reflections on what you think you need in the next sort of 6 to 12 months to kind of add that support to the work that you've been doing?
Can you hear me? I think I missed part of what you were asking. My internet is unstable right now. But I think I get most of it. Right now, well, the chair is going to do like personal consultations during this head of delegations meeting. So and what he says is that in those consultations, he wants to touch base on the most important issues that are controversial among countries. So we are hoping that those discussions can bring this topic on board, because in the distribution of topics during that meeting, we are not talking officially about production. So if we have the opportunity to bring it on, Panama will, of course, do it. But I think as for now, the window is in Nairobi. We need to find a to have that conversation there, because after that, we are going to have a document. He doesn't want to call it a non-paper, but a new document. So everyone can refer to that for the further discussions. And of course, we need to have something about production there. And I know that the scope topic it's something that we are going to start. We are going to start that point in Nairobi. So yes, I think this is the window. This is the moment that we need to secure something about production in the treaty.
Amazing, thank you. And that was, yeah, absolutely, that was perfect. That was exactly what I asked. Okay, great. Well, we're now out of time, so I just wanted to thank everybody for joining, and we'll circulate the recording because I know a lot of people asked to receive it, so that will come via emails, and we'll put it on our social media so that you can watch it. And I think this has definitely sparked some interesting conversations around the different pathways to secure something on production and consumption, what kind of negotiation modalities would facilitate that, and how we can basically bring production back and look at flexibility, differentiation, Carney Convention. Let's see where we land. But I think there's everything still left to play for, and really appreciate the leadership of the Scientist Coalition, the governments who are leading this work, and the civil society organizations that have been continuing to put work out there to sort of keep that conversation alive. So hopefully we can all continue to collaborate over the coming months to land something meaningful. So thank you again, everyone. And Dr. Michael, I'll release you to your bed, and Debbie to the Jeff Assembly, and Bethany to your day job. Thanks everyone, and wishing you a lovely afternoon, evening, morning. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.